Welcome to this week's recap of what we have been talking about at the Courthouse Bay Chapel. Every Sunday at Courthouse Bay in the chapel that I run, we have been progressing through the Gospel of Mark. And this week we started Mark chapter 8, so let's just get into it. During those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way, because some of them have come from a long distance." His disciples answered, "But where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them?" "How many loaves do you have?" Jesus asked. "7," they replied. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people, and they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also and told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 men were present. And having sent them away, he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanutha. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, "Why does this generation ask for a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth, no sign will be given to it." Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. I think that today's passage has 2 important lessons that we can really pick up on. And the first is about spiritual amnesia, forgetting what God has done in the past. You see, when Mark tells this story, it's right on the heels of another miraculous feeding story that Mark has told just a little bit earlier about Jesus feeding 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Very similar story, very similar details, a few differences. And the disciples this time around in chapter 8 act like they have no idea that Jesus can provide miraculously out in the wilderness. Earlier on, when Jesus fed 5,000, they said, "What are we supposed to do? It would take way too much money, more money than we have to feed all these people." And Jesus says, "All right, I got this." Now here they are again out in the wilderness. But this time he's not with the Jewish crowd, he's with the Gentile crowd, the non-Jewish people. And they say, "Where are we supposed to get food to feed all these people?" And Jesus says, "Hey, I got this." You see, they have spiritual amnesia and have forgotten that Jesus can provide even when there seems to be no way out. This is a very big theme in the entire Bible. People getting spiritual amnesia and forgetting what God has done. We see it in the story of the Exodus in the Old Testament. You see, God's people, the Israelites, were enslaved in Egypt for a long time. So God sends Moses to rescue them, to bring them out of Egypt into the promised land. And he does just that. He helps them get out, and they are ecstatic. In fact, they take so much stuff, more than they came with, as they plunder the Egyptians, basically, as they're making their escape. And then they get to the sea, this body of waters before them. Pharaoh has changed his mind, and he's chasing them down, and they panic. They forget what God has done to get them to that point, and they say, "It would be better for us to die back there as slaves than to be where we are now." So God says, "Don't worry about it. I got it." And he parts the waters miraculously, and they cross to the other side and keep going. But then later on, they forget again. Moses is gone, Joshua is leading the people, and they come to the Jordan River. And they're now at an impasse. They're stuck. And God says, "I got it." And the waters of the river stop up, and the people cross over. And this time Joshua says, "We are not going to forget what God has done." And he instructs the people to build a monument to remember, not just so that they remember, but that future generations remember what God has done for them. Because Joshua doesn't want them to have spiritual amnesia and forget that God has done things in the past, and know that that gives us hope for what God will do in the future. The disciples had spiritual amnesia. They forgot what Jesus had just recently done in their presence. Because if they had remembered what Jesus had done, it would have given them hope and faith and courage to know that Jesus can provide and will do so again. In our lives, we need to make sure that we do not have spiritual amnesia. It's important to remember the things that God has done for us, the places He has brought them from. Maybe you can journal them. Maybe you can build your own monuments to how God has moved in your life. But don't forget what God has done, because that will give you hope that God will do it again. And what he has brought you to, he will get you through. Not to be cliche, but that rhyme is something to hold on to. What God has brought you to, he is going to fulfill that promise and get you through. And the second thing that we need to get from this is that our faith is important, and we cannot let doubt take hold. You see, the Pharisees come to Jesus and they ask him for a sign, and Jesus says no sign will be given. And I don't think Jesus is refusing to give them a sign. I think Jesus is saying there is no sign possible that you would possibly accept. It's just not going to happen. You see, the reality of life is no amount of evidence will ever convince somebody when their mind is already made up. And this is true in every area of life. You can even see this in our nation's politics. When people have their mind made up, nothing will convince them out of their position. And the same is true in faith and spirituality. You cannot argue somebody out of what they believe. If their heart is already set in their way, they're going to hold to it. That's one reason why, as a chaplain, I don't try to convince anybody. If someone wants to talk to me about faith and spirituality, I will absolutely do that. But I know that I cannot argue someone to believe what I believe. Just like they can't argue me to shed my beliefs. That is the power and how deeply rooted our faith is in anything in life. So I think Jesus is recognizing that these guys are really disingenuous. They're not openly and honestly seeking a sign. They're not looking to see what God is doing in Jesus. And so he calls them out on it. He says, there is nothing that will be given to you. Nothing would be acceptable. So I'm not even going to sweat it. Make sure that you are solid in your faith, but that you're open to seeing what God might want to do. Don't be so hard-hearted and closed-minded that you miss what God is trying to say and bring you to. So I think this is a powerful section of scripture. One, do not have spiritual amnesia. Remember what God has done. And two, hold on to your faith, but don't be so closed-minded that you miss what God is trying to do. I hope you have a fantastic week. And if there's anything that I can do for you, please feel free to reach out to me and let me know how I can pray for you or encourage you or serve you in any way. You guys have a great day.